Hello, my name is Gary LaFree. I'm the director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, which we call the START Center for short. START has been at the University of Maryland for about the past 13 years now. We're especially interested in the human causes and consequences of terrorism, but we are actually also a research consortium that include universities around the United States and in several other countries. We emphasize especially collecting empirical data on terrorism, and our main idea really is to put terrorism into context and to treat the study of terrorism like other kinds of social sciences. So,
Dr. LaFree, where can we find this wonderful resource on the internet?
You can get information very easily about the START Center if you just go to www.umd.edu/START. Or if you simply Google the word START at Maryland, you'll get there as well. And I would recommend to the viewers that they take a look at the website. We have we have hundreds of research articles that you can download. We also have all kinds of much shorter stories that have gone to press releases or gone to for reports for government agencies. And we also put actual data on the website. So you can go to the website and download, for example, the full global terrorism database as well as 15 or 16 other databases. I might also recommend to you, if you're interested in the START Center, to subscribe to our newsletter. Our newsletter goes out to about 15,000 people every month, and it's packed full of information, vignettes, and also important new research being done on terrorism.
It's a wonderful research, and while we're there, could you define for the lay person, not necessarily the scholars that you usually deal with, what terrorism is definitionally? Because a lot of times we're seeing now people say, well, one incident is terrorism and another isn't. How would you define terrorism?
Sure. So actually when the center began, which is now almost 14 years ago, this came up because we had probably 50 different professors and researchers working on topics. And what we decided then is actually we would let people, to some extent, choose their own definition of terrorism, as long as they were transparent in how they were actually defining it. I would say though, like for example, for the Global Terrorism Database, which I've been most closely involved with over the past 15 or 16 years, we've always defined it essentially as violence or the threat of violence for a political motive carried out by a non-state actor. It's a little more complicated in our definition, but basically that covers the essential elements of it.
And what are some trends? You have such a wonderful collection of research.
Thank you.
And scholars, let me just, please look at this website. It's arguably the best compendium of terrorism incidents and research out there. What are some trends that you've been noticing over the last 5 years or even 10 years?
Well, actually, I think with the Global Terrorism Database, for example, we see this, as David Rappaport and many others have pointed out, terrorism tends to have this wave-like feature. And the period we're in right now, which really started about 2001, 2002, where you start to get this big uptick in terrorism, and an uptick that's been especially important in the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and somewhat in South Asia. We've actually, for the last 2 years, we've seen declines in worldwide attacks as well as worldwide fatalities. So it's still a little early to tell if we've hit a peak in terms of worldwide terrorism, but I will say for now 2.5 years, we've seen a pretty substantial drop-off. And it's pretty widespread too. I think 4 of the 5 leading countries in terms of attacks have seen pretty substantial declines. We've also seen, of course, declines in major groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and even groups like Boko Haram. So I'd say it's a little early to tell, but there's a bit of good news, even though total levels are still at record highs. And actually, I guess the perhaps bad news about this trend is that we're seeing terrorism affecting a larger number of countries altogether. So it's like spreading out, but the total attacks are declining at the same time. So a little bit of good news, but also a little bit of bad news.
And the countries with the most terrorism, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan?
Yes, so the lead would be Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and depending on the specific year, Nigeria has been in the top group as well.
And what about some changes in tactics?
Well, I think we're seeing, that you constantly get evolution. Like if you look at the bigger picture, for example, we saw almost no suicide bombings until the early 1980s, and then we're seeing, quite a number of them. We also saw a big uptick in explosive devices around roadsides and so on. And then most recently we've begun to see a couple of concerning trends, like the trend of using vehicles to run them into civilians, and also the cases involving people who just go in with a knife and start stabbing as many people as possible. I think those are some relatively recent trends. And I suppose on top of that, we're seeing more of what we call compound events where, there's a bombing, let's say, and then when the first responders go to save the victims, there's another bomb that goes off, or perhaps coupled with a shooting. So we call these compound events. Those are also on the rise.
Are the use of knives and vehicles an indication that perhaps terrorist groups are having trouble training people and getting them to where they want them?
I think they're definitely a representation of the fact that terrorists have to rely on readily available, low-tech ways of attacking. So basically, just about anyone can get access to a vehicle or a knife. That's, I think, to some extent always been true of terrorism. If terrorists had military-grade equipment, they would be fighting a war, not terrorism. So they tend to use relatively easy to get access to equipment.
What would your reflection be on the commentary that we have a very diverse matrix with respect to ideology?
Yeah, I think that is true. It certainly changes over time. I mean, most of the action right now in our databases are coming from the radical right and from radical Islamists, and it would have been quite different in the 70s and 80s when left-wing cases were much more common. But yes, it continues to evolve, obviously.
And that can make backlash as well. We saw an increase in anti-white hate crime last year, and the emergence of violent armed Antifa folks responding to the perceived growth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of the alt-right.
Yeah, there's often a kind of a push and then a coincidental pushback.
Is there anything that we missed? Because it's such a pleasure to get someone of your expertise.
Well, I think actually one of the things about terrorism that I find interesting, given that we've been studying it now for some of our databases are now about a half century old, is the fact that it moves, which I think a lot of times people miss that point. That back in the 70s, most of the attacks that we were looking at were in Europe and in North America. In the 80s, most of the attacks were in South America and Latin America. There was a kind of a transitional period in the 90s, and then in of course more recent days, most of the attacks have been in the Middle East and in Sub-Saharan Africa.
And what do you believe is the current state of the terrorist threat in the United States?
Well, I think it's varied, it's dissipated, it's almost entirely domestic. I mean, you have ISIS claiming some of the attacks, but the people involved have generally had no direct contact with ISIS except through the internet. The rates are much lower than they were back in the 1970s, but they have ticked up a little bit in recent years. And I think right now the two leading ideological sources are essentially right-wing and Islamist. We have relatively few left-wing attacks right now.
But you have your eye on them as well.
Of course.
Well, thank you so much. And please tell us the website again so people can...
Yeah, you can go to www.start.umd.edu.
Dr. Gary LaFree, who founded the START Center and was the first head of the American Society of Criminology's Bias, Crime, and Terrorism Division. Thank you so much for talking to us today, and go Terps.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.